Our next presenter is Dr. Thomas Richardson, and before I introduce Tom, his title today is An Army Transformed, the Australian Army's Road to Vietnam, 1953 to 1965. Tom, welcome to Melbourne, Canberra. Tom is an historian with the University of New South Wales and currently presents to the Australian Defence Force Academy students. He is an author, published author of a number of histories of insurgency and counterinsurgency. His first book, Destroy and Build, Pacification in Phuoc, 1966 to 72, was published by Cambridge in 2017, 9 years ago. Goes quickly.
Sure does.
And his most recent book, Soldiers and Bushmen, the Australian Army in South Africa, 1899 to 1902, was published also by Cambridge. Darryl, I reckon you've probably spoken to Tom a few times, have you?
Nice to meet you.
And he's currently working on a history of the Australian Army and limited war in Asia. So Tom, welcome to Melbourne, welcome to our conference, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Murray, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Stephen. I have made the Lubbock Southeast Australia trip. I think it's a very, very long way, so I appreciate the effort. And thank you to everyone online as well. It's great PowerPoint craft to start off with what looks like a complicated maths equation. It really engages an audience. And also, any maths savants out there will notice that the figures for 1966 don't actually add up correctly. I noticed that myself yesterday as I was putting it together, and I can only blame the Commonwealth of Australia Yearbook 1966. Someone missed it then, so I'll try and get to the bottom of that. This sort of goes to the heart of what I want to talk about. Obviously, you can see from those figures that the Army more than doubles in size between the election of the Menzies government in 1949 and the commitment of 1ATF to Vietnam in mid-1966. But, of course, the figures don't actually really do this justice, right? It's not just that the Army gets much bigger, it's that the Army actually changes significantly. It goes from a force that is focused on the citizen soldier to one in which the regular is in the ascendancy. It goes from one that is focused on the idea of mobilising for a third world war around that citizen soldier to one that becomes a tool of national power, and this has been sort of discussed or articulated by people like Professor Mike Evans, but never really developed beyond that. So there is no existential threat as the government sees it in the 1960s. There's a very serious threat in Southeast Asia, but not an existential one. The Army is used as a tool of national power, not only to achieve outcomes on the battlefield, but also to achieve political outcomes with allies. That's a pretty fundamental shift, and it's one that persists through to today. There's also other changes. Way back 15 years ago when I started my PhD, a Lieutenant General who shall remain nameless sort of said to me in passing, when I enlisted in 72, I think, it was an Asian army. They served curries in the mess. And I kind of thought, I don't think you can hinge the statement it was an Asian army purely on what they were serving in the mess. That's untrue. But the idea has stuck with me, right? Because it is actually true. When the army comes home from Vietnam in 72, and indeed slightly beyond that, it is an army that has been fighting but also living in Asia since 1945, either in garrison duty in Japan or Malaya, the deployments in Vietnam, Pacification, Korea, etc. And so it hasn't just been there, it's also been thinking about Asia in certain ways, and that influences it as well. And then finally, does anyone care to speculate? There's 2 categories up the top, and yet there's 4 categories for the 1966 figure. I'm not going to reward you for correctly guessing that the top 2 are ARA and CMF. What are the other 2 figures Down. Nashos and? No. Sorry?
Greeks.
Nope.
Female. Women.
No.
Reserves on full time.
Papua New Guineans. So a significant chunk of the army is Papua New Guineans in this period as part of the Pacific Island Regiment, as my colleague Dr. Tristan Moss has written about extensively. So it is an army that is very different by the time it goes to war in Vietnam, and that's the changes I want to explore today. If I can get the next slide, please. Why does the army change? It changes because the government's view of the situation it is in changes. So when the Menzies government is elected at the end of 1949, it has a worldview that says there is, as someone said earlier, communism is a united front in which Moscow controls everything that happens. The view is very much someone in Moscow pulls a string and Chin Peng in the deep jungles of Malaya stands to attention. Now we know that it was a lot more complicated than that, right? But that was the view at the time. And even before, in the last days of that Labor government that precedes Menzies, there is already a growing commitment to the idea that Australia will raise a third AIF, and that third AIF will deploy in line with an agreed ally, that is to say UK and US-led global strategy. That will almost certainly be in the Middle East, with the job of protecting air bases for nuclear bombers, which lies at the heart of that allied strategy. And the coalition agrees with that idea, broadly speaking, and they take to the 1949 election the first national service scheme, the idea that we will give young men limited military training to create a pool of partially trained men who we can then mobilise for this third AIF when the Third World War comes about, as they sort of believed it would imminently. You read policy documentation, you read what the Liberal Party is saying at the time. The analogy is 1937, 1939, but this time we're not going to be caught out, right? We're going to, there will be no Munich, there will be no repeat of, the experience of the 8th Division in Malaya, for example. Get the next slide, please. And then, of course, less than a year into the Menzies government, the Korean War breaks out. And one of the arguments I want to make is that actually, I think the Korean War has enormous ramifications for Australian policy and for the army that are perhaps not fully understood or emphasised sufficiently. So one of those is that it is the model for future conflict in Asia. It is this high-intensity conventional war, but it is geographically limited to the Korean Peninsula, and again, I think we've already mentioned Douglas MacArthur's abortive attempts to expand it. Those are nixed both by the Truman administration, but also an Australian government that is very against this idea of expanding the war and makes that view known in Washington. But it never escalates beyond a certain level of violence, right? And in particular, the use of nuclear weapons, which back then, remember, there is no great taboo around, or it is only developing at the time. They are just still seen as very large bombs. And so even if it's not explicitly said, I think that view shapes everything that comes after of Australia and the Army's view of the kind of war it could fight in Southeast Asia going forward. It could be geographically limited, but also there will be a certain level of violence that will be reached. The other thing is it anticipates the primacy of the regular. Obviously 3RAR is deployed, the government declines to mobilise the CNF. It does supplement recruiting with K-Force men who are recruited for the war, but it doesn't mobilise as such. It also demonstrates the way in which, in order to respond to the needs of an ally and to generate political support with that ally, because that is why 3RAR is deployed, you need a force that can deploy quickly. And again, that is a regular soldier, that's not a citizen soldier. And those two things become shape as major drivers of Australian security policy, and consequently the shape of the army moving forward. Thanks. Who's in the picture? It's Badco, very good, thank you. But in Malaya, not Vietnam. So the shift to Southeast Asia, we don't need to go through all the twists and turns and the various dramas that shape Australian defence policy between 1952 and 1955-56. The commitment to the Middle East and then walking back from the commitment to the Middle East, and we're in Fezzer and we're going to fight for Malaya. ably documented by many people, notably Peter Edwards, in the official histories. What really matters is that from 1955 onwards, and actually even earlier, the Chiefs of Staff Committee write an appreciation for Menzies in September 1950, in which they identify Malaya as the key territory for the defence of Australia. Malayan Peninsula, you control the Malayan Peninsula, Australia will be safe. If you lose it, there's a problem. The key territory for the defence of Malaya is Indochina. And so, it's interesting in that 1950 appreciation, you know, there's this apocalyptic, if the French lose Tonkin, it's all over. And then they lose Tonkin and it's not all over. And suddenly it's, oh, if they lose, you know, the Mekong, it's all over. And no one ever sort of seems to certainly put down in writing, well, if, you know, do we need to reassess this entire model based on events? And I think, again, just, you know, throwing something out there while I'm up here, but in the arguments about why Australia makes the final commitment to Vietnam in 1965 and the various debates about that sequence of events, etc., I think one thing that is not overlooked but is not emphasised sufficiently is that, you know, for 15 years essentially, Australian policymakers, senior military leaders, senior figures in government, and they are often the same senior figures, right? It's the same conservative government, liberal government. They have been marinating in this idea, Malaya is the key, Indochina is the key to protecting Malaya. It is just axiomatic for them at that time. And I think that very much shapes their decision making to the point where they don't feel the need to put it down explicitly in their various justifications for going to war in 1965. In any case, that decision, that identification of these two areas of key terrain helped shape the 1956-1957 Defence Review, which explicitly says we need to shift to a force, an army that emphasises the regular, that can be deployed rapidly, and, you know, doesn't write off the CMF or the citizen soldier, but sort of makes clear that they are now no longer the priority. At the same time, Australia makes a commitment, obviously, to the Far Eastern Strategic Reserve, and that becomes that first deployment, permanent deployment into Southeast Asia with the 28th Commonwealth Brigade. But also that commitment to CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation. Those two things together create the framework that guides the Army's thinking about how it is going to, or where it is going to fight, who it will fight alongside, and in particular, who it will fight with, in the sense that the initial Australian commitment will be as part of the 28th Commonwealth Brigade. Future Australian reinforcements might operate independently, but initially you're going to be part of this British Commonwealth force that will fight as part of the CETO deployment somewhere in Indochina, probably later. Thank you. 7 RAR vets, who is it? Unless there's multiple Ron Greys. I gave it away. Very young Ron Grey, apparently, so the War Memorial tells me. I bring him up because he's one of these figures who engages, is in this intellectual ferment that I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so the Army knows where it thinks it's going to fight, and it knows who it thinks it's going to fight alongside, and it knows roughly the circumstances of conflict it anticipates will occur. But then there's this question of, well, what is that war actually going to look like? And again, you know, talking to the contemporary Army now, I think it's forgotten that because the low end of the spectrum the low end of the spectrum, it wasn't on the low end if you served in Vietnam, but you know, there were no tactical nuclear weapons being thrown around as they thought there might be. We forget the extent to which the Army thought it might fight a much more high-intensity war than it actually ended up fighting in Southeast Asia. So on the one hand, you have the Malayan emergency, this kind of low-level, long-term insurgency in which the largest Australian engagement is a platoon plus. And then you obviously have Korea, very high-intensity conventional war. And then you have this French experience in Indochina in the middle, which sort of has elements of both. And so the Army recognises that it has to be able to fight all of these kind of wars, and it might actually have to fight them at the same time, that those threats could occur simultaneously. So that's quite a complex intellectual challenge, right? How are we actually going to do this with a very small army? How are we going to train for it? How are we going to organise for it? At the same time, there is actually an organisational issue. And it's, again, there's this really interesting dynamic. The Army is constantly struggling to gain the manpower necessary to meet the force structure that it thinks is necessary to meet the government's strategic requirements. And it gets close, and then the goalposts shift. And that happens essentially for nearly a decade, from 1957 through to 1965, when national service is introduced. So, for example, it recognises that its dreams of being able to send a brigade to Southeast Asia are not going to happen as long as that first national service scheme is in effect. It convinces the government to get rid of the national service scheme in 1959, and then the Indonesian threat starts to emerge. It's like, oh, well, we might have to send the brigade to Southeast Asia, but we still need to defend PNG, or we've still got this commitment to Malaya that might attract forces elsewhere, and so on and so on. It's also tempting, I think, in hindsight, given everything that happens, and everything that happens after 1975, to view the CMF at this point as an anachronism, that it didn't have a role, and it was kind of undergoing this long lingering death. But it is interesting, again, in the documentation, the Army, and I know CMF officers believe there was this professional conspiracy, the regular conspiracy against the CMF. But these ARA officers go to the mat and fighting these quite public, dirty battles within the joint planning machinery in front of civilian government about the relevance of the CMF, because they recognise, and there's an interesting parallel to today, they recognise that the regular Army had no staying power. Who's going in as casualty replacements when this brigade goes to Southeast Asia? The cupboard is already bare back home, right? We've stripped it to make this brigade. So the CMF is still a critical second echelon function. So they are still fighting for it. But it raises the question of, will you meet a political threshold where the government is willing to call up the CMF? And that's sort of a question the Army can't answer, but it's one it grapples with throughout this period. Again, nothing like putting a huge slab of text in very small font. I put this up because I find it a fascinating document. One of the Army's responses to this problem is the Pentropic experiment, right? Which is obviously a disaster. Yeah. A massive reorganisation that fails. And in hindsight, even more embarrassing is it's based on an American model that we now understand was never meant to work, right? The Pentropic experiment in the United States was a PR exercise by Army Chief of Staff General Maxwell Taylor to show the relevance of Army in a nuclear age. It wasn't a thought through doctrinal decision. But the Australian Army follows because it feels it has to, right? It needs some way of solving this conundrum that I've just outlined. And so this is the document from DMT that is sent around in 1959 outlining this is how it's going to be, this is why we're making these changes. The division must be organised for anti-insurgent operations and for limited war which could develop from them. So this idea that there's this spectrum of conflict and the Army has to be able to move across it, and that a war can start as an insurgency, end as a limited war. The division must be prepared to fight primarily a mobile battle in all types of tropical terrain, paddy, hills, plateau, open country, savanna, jungle, in a climate generally hot and humid, but sometimes cold in the mountains. Under extremes of wet and dry weather by day and night. Poor road communications. Large-scale protracted defence of a static nature is not envisioned. So they gave him something, right? And then the division must be prepared to operate in the face of a nuclear threat. The division should have a nuclear capacity by having available to it the support of weapons which can fire both conventional and nuclear projectiles. The division must be prepared to fight without nuclear support against an enemy who has vast numerical superiority. So it's an extraordinary challenge that's being laid down, right? You can understand why they're trying to innovate in this circumstance, but also just that spectrum of it could be the Malayan emergency, it could be the world's first nuclear war. You've got to be prepared for both, maybe at the same time. So Pentropic is adopted in 1959, it's abandoned in 1965 when it becomes clear it is dysfunctional. It doesn't offer the advantages that were promised, but also it puts unrealistic expectations on it, the relevant headquarters, it's unwieldy in the field to manoeuvre, etc., etc. But at the same time as Pentropic is happening, the Army is also pursuing its development of what it calls counter-revolutionary warfare doctrine. Now, folks, we've got the goat here, Colonel Rich Bushby. This is the definitive text on Army doctrinal developments. You can download it from the ANU website, even though it was a UNSW 85 honours thesis. Let's not get into the politics of that. But I don't want to rehash too much of it, beyond the fact that what Rick shows is you have the Army, its experiences fighting a counterinsurgency in Malaya, and it's drawing on the practical experience of 28th Brigade in doing that, and the battalions that go through. It's making an effort to learn from across Asia, so officers are going on study tours to places like Vietnam, but also the Philippines, etc. But it's also engaging with this wider coin firmament. There's this idea that Western militaries are ignorant of counterinsurgency in the 1950s and 1960s. Gregory Gaddis, who's the guy who wrote the US Army official history? Anyway, it's excellent. That's not helpful. The US Army official history, I can't remember his name.
I'm getting a more careful article.
No, he does one on the US Army and counterinsurgency. He wrote it like kind of around the Iraq Surge. Anyway, shows that a lot, the US Army is thinking about this a lot. There is this movement of intellectuals who are grappling with this. People like Bernard Fall, who's obviously a kind of, not a practitioner, but, has seen it firsthand and then is writing about it. And so the Army is engaging with that in difficult circumstances, right? A pre-internet, not even just a pre-internet, but like a pre-word processor era. It's not easy to get that stuff, but they are trying, and they start to build a doctrine that is functional. Next slide, please. And then you move into the 1960s, and the key terrain simultaneously narrows and expands. It expands in the sense that the Indonesian threat emerges, beginning with armies planning around potentially intervening to protect the Netherlands, New Guinea, today West Papua, which itself is a really fascinating little episode where it becomes clear that the Army can't fight in the archipelago because the Navy has not invested in the relevant, there is no amphibious capability in 1959, as there even was by 1965, and that comes as a nasty shock to the Mandarins in Canberra. That threat gets worse and worse. Obviously, culminates in the start of Konfrontasi in 1963. So in that sense, the Army's problems have expanded, but then they also narrow in that the Laotian crises and then the neutralisation of Laos in 1962 narrows the range of terrain in mainland Southeast Asia. If there is going to be a fight there, it is going to happen in South Vietnam. The deployment of the AATTV to the RBN from mid-1962, again a primarily political move, but one in which again allows that kind of learning network that the Army has built. AATTV starts funneling information back to Australia, and the Army starts thinking more clearly about, well, this is the fight we're going to have, right? But it still has this problem of it might have to fight in PNG, it might have to fight throughout the archipelago or in Borneo. Next slide, please.
Is that who you're looking for?
No, sorry. This, for sure I'll be on the plane tomorrow and suddenly it'll pop into my head. On the other hand, I refer to him in my book, so if you want to just pick that up, cheap at $60 in my view. At the same time, so the Army has this problem, it invests in alternate methods. One is the Pacific Island Regiment. Again, my colleague Tristan Moss has written about this extensively. Sort of forgotten, forgotten is the most overused word in Australian military history, but sort of true in this instance. It's raised in the early 1950s, it's expanded in the early 1960s, again as a response to the Indonesian threat. It gives the Army manpower, but it is also, like the AATTV, it draws on experienced NCOs, junior officers, technical specialists, etc., that the Army can't really afford to give up from its line formations. So it's growing, but there's still that manpower pressure. The other one is special operations capability. Very sad that Professor Horner can't make it, because I was going to throw in a little thing about actually was the Army's first investment in special operations capability the raising of ACES to try and read his facial expression. Certainly formally, it's the re-raising of the CMF commando companies in 1955, and then the SAS, which of course has expanded into a regiment in 1963-64. They provide specific tactical capabilities, but again, it's really interesting if you look through the Army Journal for this period. You see a lot of evidence for that engagement with Asia. Some of it is crazy, the stuff that is being written, and from the perspective of 2026, you kind of, that's wild. But others, is this, are these very specific arguments about, well, this is how we want to fight, or this is how we could fight. And one of the things that comes through is this idea of using irregular warfare as a way to compensate for numerical inferiority, that numerical inferiority put out in the Pentropic document. And even the idea of the nuclear battlefield. So there's one article that argues, well, if we sort of raise these armies of Montagnard tribesmen, they're not a very good target for tactical nuclear weapons. So they'll kind of exist in this liminal space between the two armies, avoiding being nuked. Which again, it's a crazy thing to say in 2026, but that was how the army was thinking at the time. And again, I probably should say as well there, obviously the PIR becomes the core of the PNGDF through to this day, but that growth of special operations capability, that is something that persists in army to today, right? And in some ways shapes army really profoundly to this day, in a way that, they just got rid of it in 1945, all the capability built up over the Second World War. There's no guarantee that that will come back. How much longer have we got, sorry?
5 minutes.
Whoa, gosh, so you have all these problems. And again, something I found really interesting in the documentation is the deep reluctance of the army when faced with these manpower issues, when faced with sort of the inevitability that it needs to be bigger to meet the requirements set for it by government in from 1963 onwards. It's deep reluctance to countenance the idea of some form of conscription. The army has to be really dragged to national service. And that's, again, that's often set as the conspiracies of the regulars. They feel they've overcome one lot of citizen soldiers, they don't want to add another. But actually, again, if you sort of get into the organisational documentation, it's a practical problem. It's how do we absorb recruits while keeping operational capability, which we think will be needed any day, either in Borneo or PNG or Vietnam. Obviously, the model they come up with that does that is by making it highly selective. And again, I think that's something that the broader Australian public forgets about national service, is that it put an enormous burden on very few, because that was the only way the army could manage it. National service was highly successful in the sense that it builds the army that the government feels it needs. So you go from 4 under-strength infantry battalions to 7 by 1966. Obviously another 2 are raised on top of the expanded PIR, an expanded SASR, etc., etc. So it is a success from a policy point of view. I think it is also really interesting in the way the influx of personnel changes the army in certain ways. I think this is something that could be explored further. Again, my colleague Tristan, he better buy me a coffee, having name dropped him 3 times. He's written a really fascinating article about the influx of teachers and how that allowed the army to essentially train the nucleus of the PNGDF in the late 1960s, early 1970s, which it did unilaterally without government direction, that said, well, we've got to get these guys ready for independence. And part of that is they need to be able to read and write, because we're not going to be here pretty soon. And conscription allowed, national service allowed the army to do that. More broadly, the endless anecdotes about how Nashos were different to regular soldiers. They fought very well alongside each other and they meshed in units, but they brought a different perspective. And I think, again, there's a sort of irony there, right? That the triumph of the regular brings back a form of citizen soldier during the Vietnam War. All right, next slide, please. Very quickly, because I'm sure Bob will cover this tomorrow, the army arrives in Vietnam with a clear idea of how it wants to fight. That idea does not prove entirely successful in practice. In particular, the need to kind of integrate combined arms to a greater degree is one of the struggles the army has across its time in Phuoc. You can see here that, again, it's really fascinating, like the fight to deploy the Centurions in 1967 and the opposition from certain quarters of the army. And then they proved, difficult, right? I don't know if we have any ex-Centurion drivers here. Stories about being bogged, how maintenance heavy they were, etc., but a tactical success. So that goes to the way the army still needed to learn. Also, I wrote in my book about, yes, it has a clear idea of how it wants to run a counterinsurgency campaign, but what is the role of Australian forces within that? They never actually really settled senior leadership of the Army on the answer to that. But there is a contrast with confrontation. The Army goes to this bizarre war that is secret, where we maintain full diplomatic relations with the country we're fighting, and again found a bizarre record of conversation between the Australian ambassador and the Indonesian foreign minister, in which one says, you know, have you killed any of our blokes yet? And the other one says, no, we unfortunately lost a guy to an elephant, but that's it. And then they just keep talking about something else. I think confrontation is hugely understudied for what it sort of says about the nature of war, etc., and as an example of certain types of Australian foreign policy. The Army doesn't have a clear idea of how it wants to fight that campaign, but it is extremely successful because it has mastered the basics of fighting in the jungle over that previous 15 years, even before then, you know, drawing on that experience in the Second World War. My colleague, Dave Kilcullen, always does this, and I tried to come up with a fancier, less aggressive title for this slide this morning and failed. So what? What does this matter? I think the Army transformed between 1949 and 1966, and indeed through to 72, 75 in some profound ways. I've only touched on some of them here. I think there's much more work to be done in this space. The obvious one, and again this has been discussed a bit in the literature, is the rise of the regular, the triumph of the regular over the CMF. How that's not just about a fight within Army, it's about Army responding to the policy priorities and the strategic situation around it. It becomes enmeshed in Asia. Again, I think that's haven't really discussed it here, but you know, a period where the White Australia policy is slowly declining and Australian governments are slowly moving away from that. The Army, you know, this kind of conservative coded institution, is actually the Australian institution that is most engaged with Asia in this period in a variety of ways. And some people have written about that, particularly around the garrisons in Malaya, but I think that's something that can be expanded upon a great deal. It raises new capabilities, some of which go by the wayside, but others which survive to this day and have kind of become really core to the Army, have shaped it in certain ways, some for the good, maybe some for the bad. And then finally, just that point that the way the government thinks about the Army changes profoundly in this period, from this kind of tool of last resort when Australia is in existential crisis, to a tool of national power which can be used in a variety of situations, not even just in conflict. And again, that is sort of the dominant way governments continue to think about the Defence Force through to this day, and it occurs in this period. And that's me done. Thank you.
Giving a bag of books to an historian is like giving a can of paint to a painter, isn't it?
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it.
Well done. Thank you very much for this morning's presentation. We might hold some questions, but I've just made a couple of thoughts as Tom was talking there. He spoke about the transformation, obviously, during that sort of 15, 16, 17, 18 year period. And I couldn't help but think, how similar is it than what we're facing today? This is just history repeating itself. I reckon it is. You know, you spoke about I thought about the similar circumstances, the geopolitical situation. Yeah, it's different, but is it that different really? It's just another threat. Weapon systems have changed, certainly. Mobility's changed. We now got to, cyber war and space war now, which we didn't have in those days as much. It really made me think about that. You also talked about, obviously, recruiting. Is it any different today for the Defence Force? Not really.
Yeah. Not
really. You spoke about national service. How many times do we hear on the media these days, oh, bring back national service? Really? Do we really want it? Does this country really want national service? Manpower issues, and the influence of more recent conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, how have they changed the psyche of Australia? A lot to think about, thought-provoking. Thanks again, Tom.
Yes, mate.
Good on you.